And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Donna Kiel. She grew up in Illinois, so she's a native. She is the founding director of the Office of Innovative Professional Learning in the College of Education at DePaul University. She also is instructional assistant professor in educational leadership. And she has developed the RISE Micro-credential Program, which supports educators with strategies to engage students and integrate racial equity in teaching. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Donna. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It is truly a joy to be here, and I'm hoping that you are now seeing my screen as we start. I've entitled our session tonight Beyond Talk, and a lot of it is because often when we come to spaces and do DEI work, we talk about it. But I believe that what we want to do in our lives is go beyond the talk and become that equity-driven human that will put DEI into action. And I am so honored tonight to both be here, but also to be joined by an equity champion who I deeply admire, who is an inspiration for me, and who often does this work with me, and has really been that flame that ignites our passion at DePaul around doing equity beyond just schools and into every place we can. So I am introducing you to Dr. Molly Cinnamon. So wave, Molly.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy and honored to be here. And I often tell people I'll follow Dr. Kiel anywhere, and she's taught me so much. So it's a very big honor to be here tonight. Thank you.
And one of the reasons I invited Molly to join me is not only because she does this work with us, but we want this work to be a little bit different than maybe what you've experienced in other places, and to be a dialogue and to really use the power of story to share with you our journey that is always evolving in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also to share with you the challenges we faced and how we've really leaned into the difficult work of equity, but the important work of equity. And I think most importantly, pause and acknowledge for yourself the fact that you're here tonight to focus on this important topic is vital. It's an important step that we all take of giving of your precious time, because you only have so much precious time, and to really spend it with equity work. So as we begin tonight, what I want to do is just kind of give you some foundational principles that, as I've done this work since intentionally since 1992, and you'll hear a little bit of that story, that I've learned both firsthand, but also from equity experts who precede me. And first, that equity work is not for the faint of heart. It's not for those, and Molly, jump in anytime. And it's not for those who want just another fluff talk on diversity. I think Molly can attest to that we don't do fluff talks.
No. And it's not a one and done, right? It's ongoing.
And it's not for people who don't want to put actions behind words. I think it's not, having been in places where sometimes DEI work is just a check the box. That's not the work that I want to share with you today, or the work that will take you on your path. And it's also not for anyone who doesn't want to recognize that the way things we've always done in this country or in any organization isn't really working for those who've been marginalized. And I'm mature enough to have been in this work for a few decades, and to know that while we thought we made strides, what George Floyd's murder proved to us is that we have not, that we haven't made the significant systemic change that we need to, as we look at what's happening in our country, even now as we face, election day in a couple of weeks. What equity work is for, it's for those folks who are ready to be honest and ready to really look at history and current events with an honest lens. And I think most importantly, it's for those who are willing to get uncomfortable. And I think that's where Molly and I have really leaned in together. And gone through a journey together. As Molly is a school principal, in addition to being a brilliant educator and having her doctorate, she's a school principal of an incredible school in Evanston. which has been on the journey to equity with Molly's leadership and with DePaul's partnership. And so also we'll have some real life stories to share. And I think most importantly, and knowing the AUW as I do, and I think this aligns with who you are, it's equity work is for those who are ready to actively work to change every space, to be one where everyone belongs and is seen and heard and valued. And I know the work of AAUW and the prestigious things that the organization has done, especially in the area of women's leadership, and certainly that is the foundational work of equity. So as we go through our session tonight, and as Elaine said, feel free to use the chat at any time. I would love if you could put in the chat just who you are and where you're from, or what chapter you're from, what brought you here tonight. That would be great as we start. And both Molly and I will monitor the chat. But I'd like us to have a couple of agreements. And that's when we're talking about this topic of equity, to use I statements and be aware that our perspective is not necessarily the given perspective. To whatever we do, whether you're speaking or writing in the chat, to speak with authenticity and allow yourself to be uncomfortable and to lean into discomfort. That's where the growth happens, as we all know. And the other thing is what we share here, though it's recorded, what we know can stay here, but also the learning can leave here. And to remember that we're all on a journey and this is all a process. I would never say that I am fully, completely evolved as an anti-racist or an equity champion. What I would say is I'm on a journey, and every day I learn more about what I need to unlearn and relearn. And I also want us to accept that there aren't those closure ends to equity work. That what I hope to do tonight with you is to share some resources of DePaul, but also to know that this work has to continually be revisited. Molly, anything you'd add about agreements?
I would say that as a school principal, I've got pre-K through 8th grade in my building. A beautiful, diverse community in South Evanston. And I will tell you that I feel now that I have been awakened and continue to wake up to what's important. Our kids are counting on us. So every day when I go to work, I really remake that promise to myself and to my faculty and my community, but certainly to my kids, that I won't stop, I won't back down, and I will fight for equity, empathy, inclusion, belonging, and compassion every single day. We meet kids where they are when they show up. However you show up, you're welcome. And we're all on this journey together. And the more you talk about it and the more you do the work, the more comfortable with getting uncomfortable you become, and that's when the magic happens. So I have become a better educator by spending time in this very vital partnership with DePaul, and I have learned so much from Dr. Kiel and her team, and the importance as a white woman of surrounding myself with strong women of color that Dr. Donna has a lot of ties with in her university role, that have really made me a better human and a better educator. So it's just ongoing. It never stops, nor should it, because we have a lot of work to do.
Thanks so much, Molly. So true. And I want us to come to this space, and what you'll see as I go through the slides are primary sources from the Library of Congress. I'm blessed to have a grant from the Library of Congress. It's actually the 4th year of the grant, with the Library of Congress supporting the work that we do around equity and empowerment, but especially to examine those primary sources, those historical artifacts that someone captured, whether it's a photo or words or recordings of our history, and to look at the moments in time that were frozen as ways that we can really open our hearts to examine equity even more deeply. So you'll see those photos as we go through, but I hope that we come to this space kind of with an open heart and mind and create a brave space for us and allow discomfort, and again, and give ourselves and others room to grow. And thank you for the couple of you who put in the chat who you are and where you're from. It's great to see a new DEI chairperson here. And I'm hoping that as you listen to our journey, that you can grab things for yourself. And so by way of introduction, and before Molly and I delve in and tell a little bit more about ourselves, what I would really love to know from each of you around that lens is if you could complete the following sentence. In order to know you, you need to know that. So in order to know me, what you really need to know is that I really operate from a lens of relationship, and that I believe all learning happens in relationship. And so that's why I'm not saving questions to the end. That's why I hope we can be in dialogue. I think as both a teacher, as a colleague, and as someone who's been trying as hard as I can to do the work of DEI, I know that it only happens in dialogue. It's only in dialogue and sharing. So if you could share in the chat your answer to that, in order to really know you, you need to know whether that's that you have expertise in DEI, or that you're uncomfortable in DEI, or that you're really tired today, or you're not really tired today, or that you're fed up with all the political ads everywhere you go, because that would be another thing. Whatever it is, if you could put that in the chat, it will help Molly and I to get to know you. I love that your daughter is watching with you. And as we go on, let me tell you a little bit about me and what you need to know beyond the fact that I operate out of relationship, that my journey into DEI began, you can see here, I am 7 right here. And in my lap, and began my journey into DEI, is my younger brother, Roger, who was born with Down syndrome. And that was back in the 60s. And those of you who might have been around in the 60s know that Down syndrome children in the 60s were typically institutionalized. And my mother definitely fell into that category of listening to what they said and institutionalized him. But it was that journey that began me being very consciously aware of difference. But what you also need to know is that I've typically served as both teacher, counselor, principal, and now professor in places that typically serve the underserved. That has been my passion. And that began very intentionally in 1992 when I was assistant principal on my second week of the job. Our students walked out in protest to a racial incident that happened. You'll hear about the Courageous Dialogue series, and there's a story that I tell in that series, but it was a pivotal point in my career at a very young age, very, very young assistant principal, when I made the decision, rather than to do as the principal asked me, which was to convince the students to come back in the building, I walked out with them. And that pivot point for me, and then listening to parents of color scream at me about their pain, made me realize that I had to do something, that it was something that was not an option. What you also need to know is that young woman who's in the lower left-hand corner is my brilliant daughter, who is my inspiration often. When she went away to college, her first roommate was a person of color, a gentleman of color, who actually happened to be one of my former students. And she was the one who faced my mother and said to her very clearly, "Mom, you have to see his color, because to not see his color, you don't see him."
Yeah.
And it was watching her at 18 to have that kind of courage that always inspires me. So please do, if you can, to add anything in the chat that you may about what we need to know about you. And I'm going to turn it to Molly, so Molly can give you a little bit of her story, so you get to know us a bit.
That's so interesting that you were talking about your relationship with your daughter and how she inspired you. I have a 19-year-old in college, and I often find myself in challenging dialogue with my own mother, who's 78, and my, greatest friend in the world. But she's in a different mindset sometimes. And when my daughter, who loves her grandma, and my mom adores her, they go toe to toe sometimes. And my greatest teacher has been my daughter. I think it's because she's so brave and so outspoken, but always at the intention of opening a door for somebody else, making it a little easier for somebody else, and learning.
Wow. Right, Molly, you muted. Molly, muted. Not sure
There I
how
am.
you-
So
there you go.
sorry. There it is. Sorry. So it's just a very important thing to learn from our kids, learn from our grandchildren. I know that someone said that in the beginning, that they're watching with their daughter, watching with their child. It's really a family kind of endeavor, and you can learn so much from each other. And so I love that story, Dr. Donna, and I love what you learned from your daughter.
Thank you so much. And what I think is important, and thank you for those of you who are sharing in the chat, and feel free to figure it out if you haven't used it before. We are patient, but I love the stories of who you are. I mean, it's important to us to look at where we came from. Part of the DEI work that I would do with young women when I was back at Queen of Peace, which was an all-girls institution, was we would really look at the legacy of women who surrounded us and what we really came to based upon that circle of women who surrounded us, because so often our lens of diversity comes from that history. So today, what we want to do is share our journey of equity with you. We want to be able to look and stretch you in a couple of ways and hopefully challenge you to grow in a couple of ways. I'm going to share two significant programs that DePaul has used that you can use as prompts for your own DEI conversations. And Elaine at the end will show you a couple that she's picked out. But the Courageous Dialogue series, which I'll tell you more about, is one that I've participated in. I was invited to participate in, and one that I'm very proud of DePaul, because it shares the lens of DEI in a narrative way using the power of the hero's journey. And then I'm also going to share with you the Build course that DePaul has available to anyone who is a member of the DePaul community, adjuncts, students, faculty, which really helps us to build our own diversity and equity and inclusion muscles. And then I'm going to share with you and have you experience part of the program that I developed called RISE. And to let you know, the Courageous Dialogue series is online. You can use that as you go through your own DEI work. And especially, I know I think it's Susan who's new as a DEI chairperson, but also RISE. RISE is one that I'm always happy to facilitate with Molly if any chapter ever wants RISE as part of the journey. For me, having done this work for a few decades, what I know is that what we've developed in RISE makes a significant impact on shifting the minds and hearts, because it starts from a very research-driven lens of that self first. We have to work on ourselves first before we can work on our organizations. So what I'd like you to do now is take a little journey with me, and Molly and I are going to play with you a bit. Well, if you have a piece of paper near you, if you could grab that and a pen. And what I'd like you to do is to make a timeline on that piece of paper that starts with the beginning of the year you entered school. So like formal school, whether that's kindergarten or first grade. So for me, that was 1965. So what's that year? And then kind of give yourself some space and then put to this year, 2022, in between there. What I'd like you to do is just put markers of time of when was the first moment or the year that you remember encountering someone different from you or from the cultural norm. When was that first moment? Kind of put that year down if you can recall it. So if you think back to your kindergarten, first grade, and think, when did I notice somebody was really different than me? What year was it? How old were you? Then what I'd love for you to do is think back to that time, and think back to that time that you're thinking of now, that where you encountered someone different. How did you feel? What do you remember feeling? And if you recall, what did you think about and what did you wonder about? Think about that. And Molly and I are going to share a little bit of our lives. So if you notice, 1965 is when I was 6 and started like formal school, although I was in nursery school. 1965 was also the year my brother was born. So someone different. But then it was 1968 And if you're a historian at all, you probably can recall what was happening in Chicago in 1968, and specifically in Marquette Park in Chicago, Democratic National Convention, the riots, and Martin Luther King marched in Marquette Park in Chicago. I lived near Marquette Park. And I can remember not understanding that there were people of color, because that was the first time I saw African American people. That same year, I happened to be a Girl Scout, and we took a trip to Springfield, Illinois to visit the state capitol.
Nice.
I was there, my mother was there with a bunch of girls. And if you remember, there was a contentious time in our country, but I was 9 years old at the time. 9-year-olds don't have a clue when there's contention in the country necessarily, or understand it.
Yeah.
And so we were in the state capitol, and I was standing on a corner, and the other girls were standing somewhere next to me. And I turned, and a young African-American woman came right up to me, a teenager, and slapped me in the face. And I didn't get it. I thought I had done something wrong. And what I was filled with in that moment was great shame and complete awe that this happened. And what I also noticed is I didn't tell anyone. And the reason I didn't is because I will forever, ever remember when that young woman came up to me, and I actually thought she was going to come over and say, "Hi, how you doing? Love your uniform. The little dorky sash and all those badges, just the cutest thing." But she didn't. She looked in my eye and slapped me, and I can remember looking in her eyes and seeing pain. I didn't see anger. I didn't see anything else. But at 9, I saw pain. And that moment imprinted in me. And I can remember then saying something to my mother of just that. I think that girl's upset, and my mother just moving us along.
Yes.
Because that's what you did. You ignored things and you moved along.
Yes.
You don't
Yes.
talk about those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the things that really is powerful when you're doing DEI work is to start with the person and start with your story. So what I encourage you to do is I'm going to ask Molly what her story might be of that first time she encountered someone different. But I'd encourage you on that sheet of paper that you've got to jot down for yourself that time that you remembered it. And if you are of a white race, there's a definite moment when that inherent bias comes through. If you are a person of color, then it is that time when that pain surfaces for you. So Molly, do you want to share your story?
Yeah, for sure. The thing I was struck though, Dr. Donna, is when you talked about when the young woman slapped you and the shame that you felt. What I was struck by your story is that your first thought was not, "Oh my gosh, poor me, I'm hurt, that girl hurt me." It was empathy for her pain.
Yeah.
And to have that first, like, wow, she's got pain. That's why this happened, right? That's a huge thing, because I think that's what you teach me all the time, is you have to start with empathy to walk in someone else's shoes, right? I love that at that young age. I actually grew up in Evanston. I was born in Evanston, and my 3 first encounters with people of color happened right around the same time. 1975, I was a kindergartner at Kingsley School in Evanston. I just lost my older brother to an illness. And so it was just me and my mom and my dad, and I had a brother on the way. And my grandmother lived around the corner from us, and she had a housekeeper companion named Catherine, who was just a wonderful, loving woman of color, a grandma age to me. And I just adored her, and I felt very safe with her. So that was a wonderful introduction to somebody who's different, who loved me, like right off the bat. Mr. Beasley was my bus driver. I was riding a bus for the first time. He would take me to school every day. And my kindergarten teacher was Mrs. Gilton. And all 3 of them, these people that took care of me, that made sure I got to school, made sure I was at school, learning at school, and then sent home from school safely, were all of color. And so I noticed a difference, but I think my first experience was so incredibly positive, and set up to be so loving that I'm very lucky, because that's kind of how it launched for me.
That's so powerful, Molly. And I'd love if anyone in the chat wants to share their first experiences, please do so. One of the things that we train folks in, especially through RISE, is how to really uncover that unconscious bias and the implicit bias. And part of it is to look back at our own life story, not at what's happening necessarily right in front of us today, but really when we had those moments in our lives, what really happened to us. The other pivotal point for, I think, many of us, especially probably many on this call, was 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And for me, the interesting thing that happened and where RISE came from, which I will share with you later on, is that we were doing a program. I was doing a program with a group of young women at DePaul, young women from the Edgewater area of the city of Chicago. And it's a leadership program and we teach them leadership training. And that program had began 2 weeks before George Floyd had been murdered. And so we were in our third session, and these were young women of color. And it was probably a little bit after the media was sharing George Floyd's murder. And we began the session and we met every Friday night. So you can imagine a group of 16-year-old girls giving up their Friday night to talk to me. And they were talking about, there was one young woman, and then I'll never forget her. And she paused and I said, "How are you doing?" And she looked at me and she said, "When will this ever stop?" And then she said to me, "I can't breathe." And I really thought she was having some kind of episode. She said, no. The pain and the fear so much, I feel like I can't breathe. And she went on to say how she could feel such sorrow knowing that George Floyd was calling for his mother, and began to weep. And it was this look in her eyes that was identical to the look in the young woman who slapped me, of this deep pain. And then she did it. Then she shifted and she said, "Dr. Kiel, isn't there something you can do?"
Yeah.
And I didn't have an answer. And I thought, I have to do something. But those moments shift us. Those moments shift us significantly. And so what's important too is to think back of how old you were. I think it was extraordinarily divine intervention that I was 9 when I encountered that episode with the African-American woman, that I could see her pain, and that just 4 years before that, I had seen that same pain in my little brother, of being different, even though he couldn't cognate and couldn't possibly know he was different than the rest of us. It was this, oh, I don't belong here kind of difference. The other thing is to always know where in your life was your first painful encounter with racism. So when was the time that racism was painful for you, that you could personally feel the pain? And for me, that actually the very first one was back in 1994 when the students walked out and when their parents came. And when the parents said to me, you, assistant principal, haven't ever really listened to us. And you, how many of your friends and colleagues are Black? There's not one Black teacher here. And I bet you don't have any Black friends, and it was very painful. Here. Yeah. But it's also true.
Yes.
Molly, do you remember your first painful encounter with racism?
I remember, what I really remember is when I was a first year principal, and right around the time that George Floyd was murdered. Donna, you and I had already met. We had already started connecting. We hadn't begun our work together yet, but we knew each other, and I knew you as this tremendous resource. And I remember waking up to the news that this had happened. And, it was the shift for me, Dr. Kiel, between being somebody who watches the news unfold and thinking, goodness, what a shame, what a tragedy, oh my gosh, And then the pivot to, I have children in my care now, because I'd never worked in a school that was diverse. Diverse to the eye anyway, diversity you could see. My schools have always been very homogeneous. And so I was really struck by the fear that my children at school, it was summertime, we had just been online for a couple of months, you know, I didn't know them all that well. And I remember calling you on a walk, Dr. Kiel, and saying, what do I do? I feel so powerless. And you said to me, this is when you teach your community that you're a partner in their child's safety. And this is when you reach out. And I started calling families of color that afternoon just to see how people were doing. And it really solidified my role as principal was so much more than academics, and really providing awareness, a respect, an insight, a willingness to learn, to be taught, to talk less, listen more. All of those things came out of the empathy that was created because I had these children, these beautiful Black and brown kids, counting on me to understand why they were afraid to leave their houses.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's so, there are those moments that just shift us. And thank you to those of you sharing in the chat your experiences. It's powerful. The thing that I want to share with you, and a foundational understanding for me, is really what happens when we have those experiences of feeling racism or feeling any kind of ism, whether that's sexism, whether that's, you know, being afraid of anything. But what happens when there's resistance to another? So what happens when there's resistance to someone of color, or if you happen to be white and you're walking down a street and an African-American wearing a hoodie walks towards you, if you clutch your purse just instinctively more. What happens is something in our brain that is often uncontrollable because it exists, and those of you who are neuroanatomists will know this and it'll sound very familiar. Our response to difference happens in the limbic system of our brain, in this lower area of the brain, and especially in the amygdala. So within the amygdala of our brain, and what science has shown us is on the left side of the brain, where the amygdala actually has two halves, just as the brain has two halves, a right hemisphere, a left hemisphere. On the left side of the amygdala lives all of those unpleasant emotions that we've had through our lives. So when we experience, the brain is in the reptilian state. So the very first thing that we do whenever we see anything, our brain always goes for the familiar. We always look at everything first from the bottom up of our brain. So the very limbic system all the way up to the frontal cortex. And so when we see something unfamiliar, our brain immediately, that amygdala part, goes to those responses of fight, fright, freeze, fawn. Flight, fright, freeze, fawn. And if you're not familiar with fawn, which is the fourth F of what happens to us when we see something that is unfamiliar, fawn is that tendency to be overly nice, or to be able to keep someone at a distance by being kind and backing up, by ignoring, in a sense, saying, oh, that's pretty, I'm not going to look over here. The reality is that amygdala response is so primitive in us that it occurs before we have conscious thought, before it goes up to the cortex. And it's the natural inborn response. You're born, and if you're white people surround you. You're born, and if you're a person of color, people of color surround you. What becomes familiar is what you see when you're born immediately. And so anything that's not in that familiarity activates the amygdala, and it shifts, and it automatically puts us into that area. So now tonight, when we talk about those things, when we talk about the things that might be uncomfortable about your inherent unconscious bias, your ability to be able to be both a person who wants equity and who might be racist in some moments, just as I am, that response is in that base of that amygdala. The good news is that becoming consciously aware of it allows you to train the brain to come to the right side of the brain, where we are empathic, compassionate, and that's where all the consciousness lives. I have the honor of working closely with Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor, who is a Harvard-trained neuroanatomist, who has taught me extensively about the brain's responses to our environment and how and through her work and through recent research studies with MRIs, she's able to definitely give you a pattern for how we can choose. That's central to the DEI work that I do, because it's important to be able to ground yourself, to be able to understand who you are and the way your brain is working so that you can do the really good work of systemic change. And so I've mentioned before the Courageous Dialogue series. And as I said, thankfully, Elaine's going to show you ones that she's picked out. There are a series of videos. So DePaul received some funding internally from DePaul to target all folks who have had a compelling story around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to be able to deliver the story in a format that would allow others to learn from the story, but also to unpack your own stories. And so, as Elaine will show you at the end of this, there are several videos to pick from. Of course, my favorite is my own. No, I'm kidding. It really isn't. But there are many different stories to pick from, and they give a little synopsis for each one so that if you as a chapter, the person who's the new DEI person, a great way to start is to have folks watch one of those stories and then to unpack it together, to start to look at what triggered you, what feelings did I have, and to use the timeline that I just gave you as an example of when in your life, in what year in your life did you experience something similar? When in your life did you know you didn't understand this? That's the way to start the conversation. And then you move that conversation gradually more and more to what in our organization can change and grow. So let me tell you a little bit about RISE, because I want you to experience RISE. So Molly and I both deliver RISE. Molly has delivered RISE to middle school teachers and to her own faculty and to folks everywhere. RISE is an acronym. Not shocking, because, you know, us in higher ed, we love acronyms. That stands for reflection, inquiry, self-awareness, and empathy. The driving factor behind RISE, the research that really helped me to formulate the methodology of RISE and the framework, was the seminal research of Kenneth Clark and his wife, Mamie, who did a 34-year study of racism. And they began with the black and white baby doll experiment, where they would give children, young children, toddlers, and preschoolers a black baby doll and a white baby doll and engage them in a series of questions of which baby doll would you want to play with, which baby doll is prettier, which baby doll is kinder, which baby doll is meaner. And both black children and white children always preferred and found goodness in the white baby doll. That launched Kenneth Clark and his wife to look more deeply at what was going on and what really was the cue. And what Kenneth Clark's research came away with, and I'm simplifying it for the sake of time, is that racism and hatred and bigotry, the missing element and what causes them to be present in our systems and our structures is the lack of empathy. The great news about that is empathy is a skill that can be learned. In order to learn empathy, you first have to go through the process of deep reflection around what's happening, that whole process of contemplative practices of really reflecting on what is the experience and the dialogic exchange around reflection. Then you also have to go through inquiry of really unpacking and being able to examine something for all of its elements. What was it that really I missed in whatever might have happened in an exchange? And then in order to get to empathy completely, you have to really go through self-awareness and that self-grounding. And self-grounding that isn't blaming or shaming, but self-grounding that really helps to give you a sense of self, of history, and a sense of self, of hope and tomorrow. So that framework, which actually is a grid, has several key questions, and I'm happy to share with any of you if you ever want to use it in your meetings. The way that we use the RISE framework is to, and I'm going to do this with you all right now, is to show you a series of primary sources. So anyone in the chat know what this primary sources event is about, what this was? a picture of? Those of you who are historians will know it right away. And you can raise your hand or unmute yourself if you want to just shout out what it is. Yes, Laura.
It's just the sit-ins at the counters and primarily in the South where people tried to sit at the counters that were segregated and were abused, treated badly, stuff thrown at them, poured on them, what have you.
Exactly, Laura. This is the famous Woolworth lunch counter sit-in. So in Woolworth stores, I'm old enough to remember this. In Woolworth, they used to have lunch counters. We had one down the street when I was in the city, right by Market Park. And so lunch counters were for white people only. And so during the Civil Rights era, there was a sit-in at the Woolworth lunch counter where African Americans, along with white folks, sat at the lunch counter. And this is a photo of several incidents, one of several, where they were harassed and victimized for sitting at the lunch counter. So in order to use RISE, to look at this from the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to look at the impact of something like this on our country and the systems that we have, we use a series of questions. And so I'm going to do that with you now. And if you would feel free to either raise your hand or put in the chat your responses to these questions. First, I want you to look carefully at the photo. Just look very carefully. And what's the first thing that calls your attention? What do you notice? Who are you zeroing in on? Or what are you zeroing in on? Just feel free to put that in the chat or raise your hand. What do you see? What do you really see? And I'll tell you what I see. The one thing that I see, yes, is a lot of white men.
Uh-huh.
The other thing I see, the guy smoking the cigarette.
Yes.
And I love Laura, yeah, the young Black woman with something in her hair. She's had something dumped on her head.
Oh.
Look in her eyes, Susan, great. The
Mm.
man pouring the drink, which I think actually, if you look carefully, it's one of those old time sugar containers.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. The other thing, do you know, here's what I noticed, I think the very first time that I really studied this is the white woman talking to the Black woman.
Yes.
And how she's positioned herself to almost be, I'm not really talking to you. At least this is what's going on in my head. You know,
Right.
It's like she's got herself turned, like, I'm not here. So now what I'd love for you to do, so this is now we're going to go through the RISE framework. The older man, the upper right, not caring at all. Yeah. Yep. Get it. Who's just, he almost seems like he's bored. I mean, he's like looking away in a distance.
And unimpressed by the abuse. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when you look at this, what feelings do you have? So I feel immediately when I look at this, heartbroken and like that awful thing, because I know what it feels like to be embarrassed in a crowd. And so I feel I look at that woman, the young African-American woman's face, and to me, it looks like she's about to cry, or might be crying. Disgusted and ashamed to be white.
And the intimidation, there's such a vibe of intimidation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is.
And it's also, I think it's grief because, as Dr. Donna will tell you with the work with these primary sources, you can't argue with this. This is history. This is a snapshot that happened. And no matter what narrative you tell yourself about, well, it couldn't have been that bad, or, you know, this couldn't have really happened. When you start to, especially in my world, we were unpacking it with children, it's really brutal because you're showing them, no, this really was the way it was. And sometimes still is. And that's scary.
Yeah. And the question that I love to use this for, to start a dialogue too, is, and somebody in the, Ken and Stephanie mentioned it, is, could you see this today? You know, how much has changed? And, you know, from just you know, sadly, listening to current political debates. And I think we saw this on January 6th.
Yes. Yes. And people are getting braver, and that's what's in the wrong way. And that's what's so scary too.
And we usually, when we go through the process of RISE, and you could see this on the RISE framework guide, which is again, a chart that you can use with any of these primary sources. The final question is what to consider is, what call to action does this bring to your heart? What do you want to do? And let's try another one. So this is a photo, primary source again, of young boys harassed. This is 1963. I always put my own age in my head because I think, oh, I was 4. But these are young boys harassing the Horace Baker family, which was the first African-American family to move into Del Mar Village in Pennsylvania, in Falcraft, Pennsylvania. And when you look at this, using those same questions, what calls your attention first? What do you see first in this photo?
That they're children, they're young people. And I really don't believe people are born this way. So someone has taught this hatred. That's what I'm struck by.
Yeah. So if any of you are historians on the call, and one of our historians, Dr. David Bates, told me how old the boy with the belt was, and I can't recall if he said he was 8. It might have been 8 or 9.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And absolutely, Marianne, where did the young boy with the belt in his hand, where did he learn that? And, you know, I noticed like the faces in the background, the little ones that are trying to, it's like they're trying to scowl.
Yeah.
And then keeping that in mind, keeping that this is so young, they're so young. What do you feel when you see it? You know, does it spark any feelings in you? And are you willing to lean into those feelings? Because it's only by leaning into those feelings that we are really motivated to not do DEI work just when we have our network meetings or when we come together as a group, but we're dedicated then to doing it every day. And we're dedicated then in the moments when someone makes an off-color comment to call them on it, or when something happens to actually do something, when there's a referendum that's wrong, to speak up. And knowing that you're in this organization, I know you're there already. And I agree, it's anger at the parents, it's anger at the systems that would allow us to have that kind of divisiveness and to say that that was okay in any kind of way.
I'm with you, Marianne. Anger at the parents.
Yeah. So let's try one more. This is actually one of my favorite photographs to use in DEI work because it's so complex. And so, you know, this is pretty sure this is one of the Little Rock 9 marching into school during segregation, and I'm blanking on her name. It'll come to me. As she's being accompanied into school. Again, what do you notice about this photo?
So much male presence.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, all boys, Sandra.
Yeah. Yeah. And remember the time and the era. So this again is during the civil rights movement. It's during the 60s when we were beginning segregation, young white boys of all ages. And it definitely is of all ages.
Yes.
It's always interesting to me to hear what people think of the young boy that is on my left, that's on the right of the young woman, the young African-American woman, whether that look that he's giving is one of disapproval or of approval. And then also the gentleman that is just one step behind this young woman, who the historian story of this is that was a neighbor who was there to protect her. but imagine too in this one, what does it make you feel? And part of, I think, one of the elements of RISE that Molly and I have encountered is those who are fearful of diversity and equity work, of seeing these kinds of primary sources and having us talk to students using the primary sources, and then fearing that we were doing cancel culture work, or that our agenda was a hidden agenda. The reality of RISE is that it's pretty nonpartisan and unbiased. It's completely nonpartisan, unbiased. We ask people how they feel when they look at something without giving any answers, because there are no answers. How you feel is how you feel. What you see is what you see. It tells you more about you than anything else.
Right.
And so Molly and I did this work, or I did this work for Molly
Right.
with some of her students. And Molly got an interesting reaction
Oh yeah.
that we wanted to share with you.
A lot that year.
Yeah, it was definitely a year of growth. So Molly, do you want to share that story?
Sure, absolutely. So we thought that a good place to start, and in my I think it was naivete, but I still cling to the fact that I just thought we'd won the lottery, because DePaul is the largest Catholic university in the world, and I'm a Catholic school leader, and I thought, I'm bringing to my students an opportunity to work with a college level, a college class, and college personnel tackling this issue. And I thought to myself, this is going to be amazing. And it was during COVID. So Dr. Donna arranged for us to have her team Zoom into our middle school classrooms to do empathy work and to really teach our students about that reflective piece, about owning your own biases, and about empathy. Because as she has pointed out, and I couldn't agree more, none of this happens unless you start there, start with self. So I thought this is going to be great. And I was really, really close to go time. We had maybe, I think it was 3 weeks in a row, Dr. Donna, for like a 40-minute. And I thought, this is going to be unbelievable. And my mistake was, and I tell every principal after me the same thing, is I didn't talk about it, communicate it enough with the parents. And really, both Donna and I agree that, in a school setting, the parents are the child's first teacher. So partnership with it is key. It's everything. But I thought, this is so cool. And I had parents not only pulling their kids out of the session, but demanding I have permission slips for this college, university, amazing work to be in my school. And why weren't my own teachers teaching it? Why was I letting, other people, outsiders, in to work with our kids? And I remember just feeling so gobsmacked by that. And then unpacking it and sitting with it, realizing that what I really wanted was to bring the programming to my school more and more. So I learned, start the partnership with the parents right off the bat, bring them into the discussion and the dialogue. So then that led us, right, Dr. Donna, to our virtual coffee that we hosted with the incredible Dr. Tina Curry, who's a colleague of ours at DePaul. Beautiful Black woman, empowered, dynamic, smart, brilliant presenter, and good friend of both of ours. And we're both white women, so we wanted to have the voice of color speaking. And we invited her to a virtual coffee. I used to do these coffees virtually once a month because of COVID. And she was our guest speaker. And Dr. Donna and I thought, well, we'll bring Dr. Curry in, and then she can answer parents' questions, and it will be fabulous. So they can ask their questions, they can hear authentically what the work is about, they can get to know and love Dr. Curry, as we all do immediately. And we had two white fathers in my school community interrupt her, not once, not twice, but 3 times, till finally a mom, a parent of color in my community, piped in and said, we invited this woman to come and speak to us, and you've interrupted her 3 times. We've heard enough from you. We want to hear from her. Do you remember that, Dr. Donna?
Oh, clearly.
And I went through a whole grief. It took me a week to summon the courage to call my colleague and friend, Dr. Curry, and apologize for the behavior of my community, I was so gobsmacked. I couldn't do anything in the moment. I was paralyzed. It was really challenging. Donna, what were your thoughts from that? Did I miss any part?
It was one of the most shameful moments of my life. Dr. Curry and I have been friends and colleagues for quite some time, and I didn't stop him. Part of it, I think is, and I know, it was my own fear of his presence and power.
Yes.
And it was the reason I share the story is what he presented was exactly what's behind this woman.
Exactly.
It was that
Uh-huh.
dominant, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yep.
And so it was a very quick kind of constant barrage.
Yes.
But I think what we learned from that, and what I learned from that, is that, and Dr. Curry said this to me, because I apologized profusely, and I said, this is like beyond. She said, stop apologizing to me for being white, and instead just do better. And so
Right.
it was this
Right.
commitment that I am not going to back down.
Correct.
And to be able to not do it with anger or any kind of negativity. And I think that's what an organization like yours doing DEI work can do, is to
Yes.
give you the language. And I
Agreed.
began to learn the language. So Molly and I often practice the language that when someone says something or
Yes.
someone does something, to say, whoa, that doesn't sit well with me. Or
Right.
the other one I learned, it was virtual, Laura. So it was a virtual meeting, which made it even, I think, a little more difficult.
Right.
The gentleman had behind him,
Blue Lives
yeah,
Matter flag. Yes.
the Blue Lives Matter flag, which spoke a lot, but it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about, part of it was everything that he said was not accurate to what was happening, but that didn't matter, because he is allowed to have his opinion. What mattered was the interrupting of a woman of color as she spoke.
It was all it's
Go ahead.
assessment though too, right, Donna? Like, we learned that day how much this community needed this work.
Yeah.
You can turn it around once you're done licking your wounds and being humiliated by the fact that this happened on my time, on my turf, with my people. I really realized, wow, do we have a lot of work to do? Let's keep going. We've got to keep going. That was a game changer for us, I think.
It was. And the most inspirational part of it came from, the reason we share the story is it's in those moments that, and Tina said this to me, she said, I was so grateful that happened, because now it's not hidden.
Yeah, you can't hide from that.
Because
Nope.
now you can do it. So I'm going to share just one more with you. And this is a very famous photo. And there's so much to be said about the woman in the back who eventually apologized. But I share it because that we need to also realize that there's not a gender difference necessarily, just that racism comes in all genders.
Yes.
And that change is possible. The fact that she eventually apologized and spoke to, and I'm blanking on her name, that shift, while it took, I think, decades and decades, is that hope that we have, that deeper learning and understanding through organizations like yours and doing intentional work can truly shift the dialogue. And as we close today, if you feel like sharing this, please do. And I will send to Elaine this slide deck so you also can have it and share it. But these 4 questions are really essential, I think, to starting your journey. Is how you feel about DEI in your life. Is it something that you do as part of this organization, or is this part of every fabric of your life? And wherever you are is okay. But it's also looking at, where does this fit into my life?
Right.
How does it fit into my life? And then what obstacles do you see? I know when I first began this work, the biggest obstacle I had, because they were alive at the time, were my own parents, who were baby boomer folks who grew up. My dad was from Arkansas and grew up on a farm and was around slaves at the time. So he had an image in his head. And what DEI worker efforts have you ever engaged in? I think it's great for you in these kinds of meetings to share that expertise, because we never know who's next to you in a Zoom meeting that may have something that can really spark you. And what do you think is your greatest DEI need? You know, for me, I know that my greatest DEI need is to continually put myself in places where I can make change, where it's the most difficult, because I grow the most. And there's a great, and you may have seen this, it's a pretty common becoming anti-racist framework of understanding where you are. And there are, typically what the research has indicated, there are 3 zones: a fear zone, a learning zone, and a growth zone. I would say that that line that is underneath is a continuum with arrows going back and forth. Because there are moments when I go right back into the fear zone where I avoid hard questions, and then there are moments when I seek them out. Because we have to realize, again, and go back to the brain, that those primal fears live in our amygdala and they don't disappear. What we have to continually do is intentionally do the work to move them. And so I ask you kind of in closing, when you think about that, what zone are you in? And how are you being educated about racism and anti-racism? And how have you confronted it? And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions with Molly, if you have questions, and then I'll turn it over to Elaine so she can share some of the courageous dialogue stuff. But if anyone has questions, put them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and unmute. Would love to hear your voices. Or I have effectively put you all asleep, which would not be the first time.
I don't think so. We have reached the hour mark. Maybe people need to stand up.
Maybe stand up, do some jumping jacks.
One thing that occurred to me, that there is a large area of the state that is rural. And so I think people in rural areas may have more growth, because I grew up in a rural area. And the only experience I had with people of color was we had international visitors that came to our church one Thanksgiving. And then when I went to college, I had a roommate who was a Black woman. So, you know, there were isms, there were conflicts between city people and rural people, and maybe wealthy farmers and renting farmers. You know, there are always groups and, you know, things happening between the different groups, people thinking that they're better than another group or they're smarter or whatever. And so I think that I love this process. It begins where you are, and it takes you through stages to really become a full-fledged developed person.
Yeah, Elaine, you named it accurately. It really is about where you are as an individual. And just since we don't have questions, let me just share a couple of slides with you, and then I promise to close. But one of the most powerful things we can do, there's a great book that I highly recommend by Dr. Sean Ginwright called The 4 Pivots. And he really looks at reimagining justice and reimagining anti-racism from these 4 central points that come from his research, and really having awareness of really looking from that lens out into the world to a mirror of ourselves. It starts within. It's looking deeply at who we are, and then looking at our relationships differently. And that's why, you know, I really know I am relationship driven, but we often have transactional relationships. rather than transformational relationships. What can I give to you so that you can then be better? But what can I give to you so you transform? That's different. It's tonight's session is transactional. I'm providing information, Molly and I providing it, and then you're to go off. I would rather it be transformative. If I could reach through the Zoom lens and say, who are you really and how can I help you to grow? That to me would be real DEI work. And here's the thing that us white women especially get caught in is that problem fixing to possibility creating. We can't fix a problem. We need to create possibilities. What are the possibilities for having far more diversity and color in your membership? I mean, it's not a secret. If you look at the Zoom cameras that are on, the majority of us are white. And so what would it take for us? What's the possibilities to be able to invite women of color into this organization with an intentionality that help them to feel they belong? And from hustle, we have a hustle culture. I'm real aware of the hustle culture. I live in it every day at the university. It's let's get shit done. Sorry about the swearing. Let's get stuff done. And to more of a flow. What can we do? How can we do this right? How can we be fully present in where we are? And if you have just a couple more minutes to hang out, I'm going to go quickly through these, but I'd love to share with you the little detours just to put them in your head and then send you on your way. And you may be real aware of these. One of the biggest common detours, I'm colorblind. But if you don't see color, you're not seeing the person. Because if you are a Black woman, a brown woman, an Asian woman, that is seeing you to see that color. The rugged, just pull yourself up at your bootstraps. I had the honor of being listening to Sonia Sotomayor and then speaking to her, and she said something so poignant. She said, I believe that not everybody can reach the bootstraps.
Yes.
And so it's really that whole bootstrap theory is misguided. So another detour that we often run into is that you're innocent by association. I can't be racist because I have Black friends or I have Vietnamese friends. Yes, you can. My dad had a great friend who was an African-American, who was really wonderful with him. And he was one of the biggest racists on the planet. And he would admit it because he grew up in that era.
Yes.
This one I fall into myself, and I don't know if any of you, the rest of you do, but I have often thought that I'm going to go save everybody. So it's that white knight or white missionary, and that's not the reality. It detours us. Or this is what Molly has fell into this, and she had an experience of this right when we began this work of the whitewash. When someone says something racist or X-racist, but he's such a nice guy.
Oh, yeah.
Molly had this with a teacher.
Yes, I did. I had a teacher on my staff. It was my first year, and she'd been there for a long, long time and had a lot of connections and ties to the community, white woman. And I was realizing her resistance to the work we were doing. She was pushing back on everything we were doing. And I finally thought to myself, I've been in her classroom so much. She's this amazing teacher. She's got this great curriculum. And I remember saying to Dr. Donna and Dr. Curry, I know, but she's such a great teacher. And Dr. Curry, our beautiful friend of color, said, she cannot be a phenomenal teacher and a racist. It's not going to work. She can't. You need to think about that. You can't say, but she's a great teacher. No, she's not. She's racist. And ended up, it's kind of bittersweet, but she ended up leaving my school shortly after my first year. And I feel like that part of my work, and Dr. Kiel has taught me this, is that this is where the bus is going. And if you're not on board, that's okay. But this is what we're doing. And so you have to say some goodbyes in your life sometimes. And it's painful, but it's necessary and it's authentic.
So true. And then there's also the bending over Black words, which I did myself when I first met Dr. Curry. I would agree with everything she said. And at one point she said, I just talked bullshit. Are you going to really agree with that? And I had to realize I was tiptoeing around her. And then there's the wonderful one that I think, some of my more older relatives have of the blame, but what about me? I've been hurt, oppressed or exploited. And the other one that I've also fallen into and tried desperately not to, of the teach me please. And going to our people of color and saying, you need to teach me about racism. No, I need to teach me. I need to observe. I need to be deeper. I need to look outside myself. I need to learn more.
It's not the
Um,
responsibility of our friends of
right.
color to help us with this. Yeah.
Yeah. Or the white on righteous racism of, what's wrong with those white people? It's those people over there. And these just give us sidescapes. And that certificate of innocence, I think, because I work in a Catholic institution, that spiritual bypassing can sometimes get in the way.
Yeah, we love everybody.
And then the lastly, the smoke and mirrors, which I think I have some dear friends who are in this, where it's kind of like the current PC language of they'll always ask me, no, it's Latinx. And so it's this kind of little sidetrack that kind of moves you out of the way. And then the checkoff, which we talked about, that accountant, and then or avoidance and stay silent. So with that, I just want to thank you all for your time tonight. And I apologize for going over. There isn't a class I teach that is ever on time. So I should have warned you in advance. But I do thank you for investing your time tonight in this. If you ever want, my services or Dr. Molly's, we are happy to do a duo presentation to organizations to guide you through any kind of DEI work. And thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you for the courageous dialogue.
Well, thank you so much. I think it was well worth going over. And I just wanted to plug the Courageous Dialogues because I think it's an excellent tool. I just picked out 4 that kind of caught my eye, but when you go to the YouTube channel, you can pick out ones that appeal to you. Value creating as a woman. I thought most of us can probably relate to this. I'm sure we've experienced some isms as women, even though we're white women, and maybe that is a theme that can bring community people together to talk about our journey in diversity. And the one at the top is the one that Donna shared with us a little bit about experiences and our journey to empathy. And then another avenue, I'm a former language teacher, foreign language, and I found the journey to multilingualism and an open mind. When you learn a language and learn about a culture, learn about other places that speak that language, it is a way of opening your mind beyond your own experience. And it makes you more open, I think, to there's not just one way, and you want to learn about other ways. And then the last one, how to be resilient and listen to your inner voices. I think in these times, that certainly is a topic for discussion. And I think all of these you'll find commonalities that can bring together a group, and maybe they're not all members of your branch. Maybe you open it to the community and it's an occasion to do what Donna is asking us to do, to listen, to grow, and make our own way in expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion.